Copyright University of Auckland, all rights reserved. The content and delivery of lectures in this course are protected by copyright. Material belonging to others may have been used in these lectures and copied by and solely for the educational purposes of the university under licence. You may record the lectures for the purposes of private study or research, but you may not sell, alter or further reproduce or distribute any part of these lectures to any other person. Failure to comply with the terms of this warning may expose you to legal action for copyright infringement by the copyright owner and/or disciplinary action by the university.
Thank you very much for hosting me and for organising this event and having this wonderful opportunity to meet you, to share some of my research. And I also am very mindful that as a visitor to New Zealand, that very much appreciate the warm welcome and the richness of the cultural practices here and the communities from which I've been privileged to come and speak at. And so I'm hoping that with all the hard work that you've been doing today, or some of you have been on holidays, I know, but are probably still recharging, but many of you have been working today. So I've brought a presentation with me that has lots of video clips, and I'm hoping that that will keep you awake. I don't have any popcorn or any other things to keep you going, but I understand there's a beautiful spread for you to enjoy after my presentation. I've also been given the luxury of being able to speak a little longer or a little less. It's quite fluid, so I will gauge the level of the presentation based on your eyes to see if you are still awake. My presentation today is essentially to explore some practices around pedagogy, but in order to do that I want to acknowledge the community that I'm a part of at Monash University and the Bunurong community, in which part of the university that I work at is actually located on Bunurong lands, and these are some of the incredibly clever PhD students that I have worked with, and some of them are graduating and some of them are still students, but they've been a part of this research.
Marilyn. I forgot to say that there's some protected images in Marilyn's talk, so if we're going to actually record the gist of her talk and have that available for you after, so if you could refrain from taking photos or audio recordings, that would be great.
Thanks. No, thank you. I forgot to. Because some of the families have permission to share the research, but don't have permission for people to take the images away. So if you want to take an image of me, that's okay. Just let me know and I'll give a nice smile. Okay. So this is the PhD community that I was just mentioning. So the session that we're embarking upon is for me to first of all declare the logic or the assumptions that underpin what I'm going to be sharing with you, because you may say I don't agree, and that's fine, but if you want to make sense of my presentation, I thought it would be important to share the logic to begin with, and particularly I want to talk to some of the concepts that I've used in this work. And my curiosity, which may not be your curiosity, but it was my curiosity that drove what I'm going to be sharing today, and then a little bit about how I went about satisfying my curiosity, if you like, by the study in which I embarked upon. So that's, and then hopefully we'll have a rich discussion. If you're looking a little tired, I've got some questions already posed, but I know Helen's got a couple of secret ones stashed on her iPad. She's going to also begin the discussion, and so you don't feel pressured to be thinking of a question, but you may have something that you particularly want to ask, and I'm more than happy to share my perspective. So this journey today will begin with the logic, and I'm just going to mention aspects of this logic now, and then I'm going to share some slides that explain my thinking around some of this logic. So the first one is that I want to, in this presentation, is declare the fact that I think that there is a clear link between imagination and abstract thinking. So that's the first thing, and I'm going to walk you through why I think that's the case. I also want to declare that I think imagination is central to play, that it's a central concept, and something that's quite controversial in Australia. I don't know if it's controversial here, but it certainly is controversial in Australia, that play is actually a learned cultural practice. And so I'd be really interested in some thoughts on that in terms of the New Zealand context, as opposed to play being something that's intuitively from within a child and just evolves. So I want to make that claim, and I won't spend a lot of time on that today, but that underpins what I'm sharing with you. But I can direct you to some resources and some studies, not just my own, other people's studies in relation to that point. I also want to declare that I think play is a collective practice. Kind of seems self-evident, but a lot of research kind of puts forward the view that the child's somehow, thinking and acting on their own when they're being analysed. And I feel it's very important for us to be thinking about play as a collective practice, and it only makes, even when a child is just on their own playing, that they are still engaged in some sort of collective cultural practice that they are embarking on. And that another premise is that play develops in complexity rather than stages of play. And I mention that specifically because in the Australian context, often play is presented as following a particular series of stages of development. And that's work that I've problematised in the past, as have others as well. That teachers have an active role in developing children's play. It's also very controversial in Australia, and I'd be really interested to know if that's an issue here as well, that we actually, as teachers, we actively contribute and are part of. And today's presentation actually centres a lot around this particular point, because it's become a little bit of a challenge for me. And then the seventh premise is that, pulling these other ones together, is that in terms of thinking about developing play, develops imagination, which in turn develops abstract thinking, which supports concept formation. That's a bit packed, I know, but that's really just pulling all of these things together. And I've written about aspects of that before. But what today's presentation is really around investigating the kind of pedagogical practices of teachers for supporting the development of play through being inside of the play with children. And that's the whole premise, I guess, or the question that I'm very curious about. And the work that I'm going to share with you is after I've unpacked some of these other points a little bit more, I want to share with you examples from my own research where I've looked at the amazing practices of teachers and had a look with this kind of lens in mind. Are teachers inside of children's play, or are they actually outside of their play? And I was very curious about that because of my previous work, which suggests that in play we can develop concepts, and I love the idea that Helen Hedges has talked about, where you're smuggling in concepts in play sometimes. And so I'm curious about this area of actually where do we as teachers actually sit in this idea of children's play. So that's what the presentation's about, linked very much to conceptual development, but mostly we're focusing on pedagogy. And I'm going to, as you would have noticed in the abstract, talk very much about a typology of play that I've developed, but it's something that needs further work. So it's kind of a work in progress, and I'd be really, really keen to have a conversation with you about what I share with you, whether it's over drinks, nibblies, or whether it's at the end through direct questions, or an email where you want to share a story with me, or something that you've done that's related to this space. So does that sit comfortably with everybody? I'll just do a little look around, eyeball everybody. Okay? Okay, great. So this is the theoretical ideas that I work with, and for those of you who have read my work, this will all be very familiar to you. But sometimes it's kind of nice to hear about the concepts from the perspective of the person who's been using them. And so each of us has different tools that we use as teachers or as researchers, and so I want to share my tools. These are my pedagogical research tools, And I want to share those with you to begin with, before I get into the actual material that, that is a little new. So I guess these are my gurus that I've worked with. Worked with their concepts. I haven't been around that long. And of course, many of you, of course, know Vygotsky's work on play, and I'm just going to highlight some aspect of that work that I'm rather attracted to. And Elkonen's work I won't spend a lot of time on, but what I do want to say is that his work, for those of you who question whether or not play is something that's part of the child's makeup or whether it's something as a culturally learned practice, may be really interested to read Elkonen's work, his theoretical work on play, because he shows through time, historically, how the conception of play actually, and the concept of childhood, not in the sociological sense, but in a cultural, historical or sociocultural way, has emerged. So that's just for those of you who are a bit interested to know a little bit more about what I read and what's influenced my thinking. And I can talk to that afterwards. I don't need slides. I can talk to that for an hour if you want. It's very nice work. As Helen knows from today, I spend a lot of time talking once I get excited about an idea. And the other work that some of you may not be as familiar with, and I have drawn upon this work more recently, is Vygotsky's work on imagination and creativity. And he's written a beautiful piece on this, quite detailed and very exciting, so I'll talk a little bit about that. But I'm interested to know whether people know about Gunilla Lindqvist's work at all on play worlds. Is that something you know about it? Yep. Is anyone else, just so that I have a sense of what you know? I'm not expecting anyone to know. It's not a test. It's just for me to gauge how much to talk about her work. So I'm assuming most people. There's a few nods. Very exciting work. It's really challenged my thinking in a really good way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about her work as well, but I'm going to talk about it in the context of some really nice video clips. So imagination in play. I just want to talk a little bit about now some of these theoretical ideas. So are you still with me? Is this not too heavy for after work or in the middle of your holidays? Okay, you just let me know. Just say, give me the cue. In Australia, it's on, get moving, just go past this. This is boring me. So if I get these thumbs going like this, I don't know, is that culturally inappropriate here? This actually, please tell me if I do something I shouldn't do. I'm giving another message. Don't want to distract you, but let me know, because there's a diversity of people in the room, and I can talk very quickly or I can talk longer in relation to some of these ideas. So, but one of the things that I think is really interesting is that most of you know, of course, that Vygotsky's theory of play, or his conception of play, is the creation of a child or an adult, or a child and an adult create an imaginary situation, and in that imaginary situation they change the meaning of objects and actions. So the classic one you would all know about is the hobby horse, putting a stick between your legs and riding around, and the child changes the meaning of a stick from a stick to a horse. And in some of my writing in concept formation, I've talked about there's not much difference between that and changing the meaning of the stick to a horse, or a stick to a measurement tool called a ruler. They're both abstract ideas that children are working with. When they're riding their horse or they're measuring something, they're using a valued form of cultural practice. And so that's kind of, for me, the important link between imagination and abstraction, and that in play. And it's a nice way for us to think about our work, because we know that play is so important in early childhood. It's the leading activity of young children, and it's really nice to be able to talk about it as not the work of children, but to actually, which is this kind of traditional rhetoric, but to talk about it as creating an imaginary situation is also about abstract thinking and dealing with really deep and meaningful concepts. It's just the conditions we create, whether it's the hobby horse or whether it's the measurement context. It's the conditions that we create as teachers that transform what kind of thinking is occurring for those children. And that thinking, of course, is abstraction and imagination as closely linked. So, but what I want to draw attention to specifically which is not so necessarily well understood in Vygotsky's work, which I think is very interesting because it's kind of a bit counterintuitive to what we often think about play. And that is that Vygotsky talks very much about when children change the meaning of an object and give it a new meaning, giving it a new sense, that he suggests that they move away from reality. So they're moving into the imaginary zone. So that's fine. But what we often don't think about, that I think is very powerful for us as teachers, is that when children are in these imaginary situations, and what they're often doing also is actually getting closer to reality because they're trying to conceptualise how their world is working. And so through play, as we all know, that they start to recreate the things that they experience. And so the argument often put forward in a sociocultural sociocultural or cultural historical perspective, is it okay if I use the word cultural historical? You can cope with that, and you can think sociocultural, just that I use that term more. So I keep slipping when I'm, when I'm talking, but you know what I mean. So if I'm using that term. From a cultural historical point of view, play actually also means that children are not just engaging in pretense and that this is somehow all fictitious, but actually what they're doing is coming to understand the way the rules and the roles of people and organisations and things around them. So they're actually getting closer to reality because they are trying to really understand their world. And again, that's a really nice way for us to think about, the important pedagogical practice of play, rather than it's the work of children. This is kind of much deeper, and it again links very nicely with this idea of imagination and abstraction, and therefore conceptual development of children as being really important work that we do, especially when we do it consciously, and I'll talk about that in a little moment. So having established these kinds of links now, hopefully, I want to, and I think I've just said this too, so imagination plays a dual role. It can lead a person towards or away from reality in this conception of play. So you can move away by changing the meaning of objects. So you make the stick become the hobby horse, or you make the stick become the measurement tool. You're actually moving away from reality, actually in that abstract world that the child is having to imagine. And so, even formulas, when you think about your own work, your own studies when you were going through teacher education, that a lot of, and even prior to that in secondary school, the formulas and the professional knowledge are all elements of abstraction, so really important concepts. But then it also leads you towards reality as you try and make sense of the roles and rules of the way society works. So it has this dual function, imagination and play. So imagination is really important. And we see this in, for example, a child who has particular objects in their early childhood setting and are actually thinking about real world experiences. So in a community where children live near the water, a lot of those communities in New Zealand, and the kinds of everyday experiences that they have that they actually can actually use in the context of the early childhood setting to actually get closer to reality. It seems like a real contradiction, but it's a dialect. It's a kind of a process of children, the dual, in and out, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But what's key for us is that, and I've used this particular image quite deliberately, of the sort of locking out, is rather than imagination being viewed as subconscious, sort of like often people think imagination is just something that happens there, and it has to be conceptualised as a conscious act, according to Bedrova, who uses cultural historical theory in the US for the work that she does. And so it's this notion of the consciousness of it. So it's not just, if we think about it as children consciously imagining, and to be consciously imagining, we have a really important role in that process, because I think in many respects, our role as teachers is kind of like the consciousness raisers, if you like. You think about any experience you've had in your life. It's when something becomes really hits you in the face. I don't know if that's an expression here in New Zealand. Consciously gets you. You really remember it. And Vygotsky's work is very much about that too, because he talks also about crisis. Somebody's trying to get in touch with someone. And that in order for children to be developing, they need something that causes this tension, this crisis, this moment that makes something consciously being considered rather than just experienced. And that's why our role again is really important, because in many respects, as I mentioned, we have a role to play in that consciousness raising, but we call it pedagogy, and we have some ways of thinking about that. So one of the things that is really interesting, again in relation to role play, is this idea of us as teachers or children or parents being inside of the play or being outside of the play. And we know from long-standing research that some of it, which is not from a sociocultural point of view, but long-standing research has, and you would know this as well in practice, that we see how children are inside play, pretending whatever the context is, but we see them slip outside of play all the time, don't we? And say, oh no, that's not right, or we need this. So they're outside of the play and then they're back in the play. But most of this research got to a point, this old research got to a point where they were noticing it, knew it was really important, and they unpacked it in a range of ways, giving various names to different aspects of children's play. That's very interesting, which we haven't got time to get into today. But they got to a point where they're saying, well, actually, sometimes children are inside the play and outside the play at the same time. And there's been some recent work that's been done to theorise this in Denmark by a person called Evie Schuschbo, who's actually gives this lovely example in her work of a child who's pretending to be flying an aeroplane and decides to crash land. But this child is in the imaginary situation, but not so far out of the imaginary situation this child's going to fall on something that's going to hurt the child. It'll fall in a set of cushions, not on the concrete. So this is kind of really nice practical example of how children are inside and outside of imaginary situations. And I mention this quite deliberately because the old work suggested it was kind of quite a clear division. This has set up a bit of for the researchers in the room, set up a real theoretical problem, which I can talk to later. It's a problem for me as well, and you'll see me skirt around this a little bit. But what I want to do is say that all of these things about being inside play and being outside of play, whether it's seen as a linear border crossing experience or whether it's seen as something happening at the same time, really matters, because drawing back to Helen's work on smuggling in concepts, sorry Helen, I keep repeating, this idea is in the relation to the sort of play that children might be experiencing is very important, because if we're thinking about concepts and conceptual development, remembering the link I've made between imagination, abstract thinking, and therefore conceptual development, and then we as teachers creating those conditions. In play, we often see examples of children role-playing certain things like cooking, and in this case, cooking porridge, because this comes from my data. So cooking porridge, and here the children were cooking porridge because they are actively involved. They're actively involved in the Goldilocks and the Three Bears as part of the imaginary situation that the teacher was creating. And I'm going to unpack it in a little while some more. But I just wanted to use it as an example at the moment. So we see these levels of reality, moving towards reality in children's play, and particularly because children are, and this is my symbolization, for those of you who know my work would have seen these symbols, but being inside of the play and being outside of the play is something I'm trying to capture as occurring simultaneously. So not like with the old work, which treats it as a border crossing experience, but as something that's happening simultaneously. And you're probably sitting there thinking, why is she labouring this point? You know, oh, it's so obvious. But you'll see why in a moment. So let me just move on and say that, so here we have the outside of the play and then inside of the play as those things happening simultaneously. And if we're talking about imagination having that dual role, then we have to, in the work of Elena Kravtsova, who's Vygotsky's granddaughter, she talks about how important it is for children to experience being inside and outside of play. That this is actually a very important psychological process that most of the Western community hasn't paid enough attention to. We'll explore that in a little while. So here I'm going to show you now, with the aid of technology, and I'm going to turn green as I go past here. As I understand, I change colour as I go across the lights. But I have to go here because I have to connect with the video clip. Before I do, I just want to tell you what this clip's for, so that you're on the same page as me. So what I'm wanting to do is give you a little journey now. So we have this wonderful teacher who's working with a group of children, role-playing Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And what we have is a context in which this teacher is exploring the cooking process that I just shared with you a moment ago here. So these are the things that were happening later, but this is what was happening before that. And it's just an everyday practice that you might experience, that you might organise. So let's just have a look at this, and the sense of this will, if you trust me, it will make more sense. What I'm going to share with you now will make more sense at the very end of my presentation. So can you hang on to the thoughts I'm giving you? So think of this as a little bit of I guess a collection of events that will culminate in something hopefully you can find valuable. So we'll have a look at this experience, and I have to use two screens to do this. Okay. And check the volume.
And they lived in a house in the middle of the... They woke up one morning, and what did they want? Porridge. Porridge. So who cooked the porridge? Mummy Bear cooking porridge today. Can Mummy Bear cook up some porridge? You do it. Show us how you cook it up. Do you need to get a pot?
I need to get that blue pot.
Bindi, could you whiz over, or Mel whiz over and get us a pot for cooking the porridge?
So cooking the porridge, and the pot's important here. Oh, I've made it stop somehow by pressing that. Okay. Did you see I maybe distracted you, but did you see the actions she gave? So some very interesting symbolic. So if we're looking at this conceptually, again, from the sorts of things we see here, what I want to do is, I'm just using it as a bit of a metaphor, but what happens when children's life experiences are actually about using a microwave and cooking porridge in a microwave. Now that doesn't seem like a very exciting idea, but it sets up an interesting tension again for the children. So if we're thinking about the consciousness raising here, and what I want to do is just, again, it'll make more sense to you at the end. These are video too, they're all video clips, but I've extracted this video clip from a slow motion, which I'll show you after. It's kind of a little bit out of sequence, but I've had to do this to make my point. But in the, are you familiar with the slow motion? It's the process of children taking photos of something and then putting it together to create an animation, and then putting a narration over the top. Is that something that happens in practice here? Yeah. So you know what I mean by slow motion. And this is, I've just taken a little bit of the slow motion that was created by the children. And, oh, sorry, I've got to look at this screen. So we're going to just look at the video clip first. This is segments of the slow motion I've just extracted. So the first one is the children's photos, and there were more of those, of the microwave and the cooking process. But there's also the children's play here. So they've created their own okay. So we can now think about this in the context of being inside and outside of children's play again. So we have this idea of these experiences that are quite different to the teacher's, I guess, conceptualization, and the children and how they're conceptualizing it. So we can actually see this idea again if we're starting to think about how to make conscious the kind of things that are important for children. And the slow motion, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, does support this process, because children can, through the photographing of their play, actually make more visible the kind of play practices that they engage in, and to start to think about that in relation to their real world. So it adds another dimension to children's play, and is very much fits with the idea of giving new meaning to objects and making conscious, through consciousness of these concrete experiences, being able to represent through slow motion or represent through the objects that they're using these ideas inside and outside of their play. So the real world and the imaginary world become fused through the play, through the abstraction, through the concepts, and they can be any kind of concept, of course. Somebody trying to link in with us, do you think? Did they? Oh, okay. Okay. And also the roles and rules, again, coming back to this idea. So we can see through this model, the imagination plays a dual role. It leads a person or a child towards or away from reality. So again, it's this dynamic process. So if this is a kind of helpful model that underpins at least the assumptions that I started to share with you, to bring them into this model. But what I want to do now is just get you to hold on to that now. We're going to look at the body of work that's come out through Gunilla Lindquist, but just very quickly, in terms of play worlds. And in play worlds, there's been a number of people who've been looking at this work, and this is also designed to be thinking about inside and outside of children's play, but it has a bit more of a border crossing idea in it, okay? And in play worlds, the Lindquist, who was the originator of this, using Vygotsky's work and using his concept of play, wanted to use play in a new way, which she did. And this comes directly from her thesis that she wrote in 1995, which has been published. When using play worlds as a concept, I mean the fictitious world or context which children and adults, note children and adults, come to share when they interpret and dramatise the themes in the classes, because she's from the Nordic context. What does this shared world look like? So it's this idea of the shared world, the shared play world. And she asks these questions, which I think are really interesting. How is a common fiction established between adults and children? And what roles do adults play in this pedagogic process? Because if we were to survey you all in this room, including myself, we probably have a range of views about our role in children's play. Possibly even on a continuum, I don't know, of hands-off to being very active, or saying hands-off but actually being quite active, and only through somebody else noticing that you're actually being active. You know how you can have that, or the opposite. So this is interesting because it's a conception, and her work is very interesting to read. It's a conception of play where we as educators, as teachers, actually actively have a role in children's play. And in her work, and those that have followed and used her work, they really specify what that means. So I'm going to show you some of that literature now. Okay, I'll just have to back up a little bit and tell you this. In the creation of these shared worlds, and I'm drawing on Hakkarainen's work at the moment, and in Finland when he was there, he used the story, this is an example just to try and get you on the same space. He used the story of Narnia as part of the play worlds, and in order to create the shared fiction that Lindquist was talking about, the way he operationalised this was that in this one where he introduced the story, in order to transition from the children's centre into the imaginary situation, Vygotsky's notion of play, imaginary situation, what he did was he created some sort of transition device. So this is what I mean about a border crossing. And for those of you who are familiar with the literature, the long-standing literature on fairy tales, will know that border crossing is an absolute, it's not called that, but it's a concept that's used to transition children into imaginary situations, particularly with some of the fairy tales, quite scary, and children need an option to go in and out safely. And so he used this idea of a box fixed, because, with the story of Narnia, of the witch and the wardrobe, if I got that right, they enter into the imaginary world through the cupboard. And so he just used the door frame between the kitchen and the playroom as part of that process to create this imagined space. Beth Fairholt in the US has used similar things, but her research has been on teachers and how teachers create and feel comfortable in these shared imaginary situations. And the other example he provides in some of his work is that creating something really interesting like the spell on a palace, turning it upside down and making everyone walk backwards. So children put their coats on and start walking backwards. And that in this land, and the minute they leave this land, of course, they put their coats back on the right way and then they walk. So it's to signal the imaginary situation. So it's interesting pedagogical devices grounded in a lot of work of various scholars. But what's also important in this work is, according to Hackarainen, is that the pedagogy of play worlds, of the shared fiction, is framed through a telling or reading of a story, and the children and the teacher work together to create the play. So it's not necessarily following the lead of the child, which we often has been conceptualised in early childhood, but actually following the lead of the play, which is then elaborated further through kinds of problems that they may encounter. And this is where the pedagogy of the teacher is quite significant, because, as you'll see in a moment from Hackarainen's research, that there are always dips in developing children's play. So when children are engaged in this kind of imaginary situation, and the teachers are actively going on the journey together, and Lindquist has a lovely example in her work where they have a hot air balloon, which is really just a basket, and then a cardboard balloon, and they all hop in the balloon and then they go off to different lands and do explore and share this. They encounter all these problems. And in her work, because she was the teacher, she also created the problems that the children had to solve. And of course, the moment you start to do that, you do as Helen says, you can smuggle in, if you want, concepts that you want to specifically develop. But in this play world's pedagogy, it's not about smuggling, it's actually real. It's part of the pedagogical practice. And the role of adults is really important in this context. And as you see here from more recent research by Hackarainen, Bredikite and two others, that there are interventions, because they work on sort of this notion of narrative role play, to name their practice. And so this is actually quite interesting, because this is how they identify how they're going to do this. They talk about a coherent and fascinating script to engage the adults as well as the children. So in other words, you just don't choose a storybook that's just of interest to the children. You choose one you like as well, and has lots of possibilities in it if you want to use a story rather than a fairy tale or some other activity. There has to be, in this play world, a dramatic tension. So there's got to be this tension. Something has to be solved. Children have to get really excited about something that has to be done. And so that they are really engaged in the imaginary situation. There is usually a motivating shared theme of some kind. There is, this is really interesting, emotional involvement of the adults. So it's not just us pretending to think this is fun. We're actually having a really good time in this imaginary situation with the children. And if any of you are interested in Beth Fairholt's work in the US, that's the part that she's really explored, and she's really looked at how the emotional reactions, not reactions, the emotional engagement of the adult can be really seen in the work that she's done and with the children. And we know children do social referencing, so if the adult's being really scared, you know, this creates some really interesting and exciting moments for emotion regulation development. Rather than serendipitous moments when children are having an emotional crisis of some kind, this is actually about the creation of this in the way that fairy tales actively do as well. And there is this dialogic character of interaction, so the co-construction of play events. So the children are not passive recipients at all, but neither are the teachers passive in this process. And adults have an active in-role position. This is the bit that's really challenging, and you'll see in my own research this has been really challenging for me as well. Not for me, well, for me and the teachers, is that they actually take on a character in the play. They're not just the narrator or the provider of materials. They actually become the witch, or they become something in the play. So they actually have an active role. And elaboration of critical turns in play, such as anticipating potentially boring moments and introducing new characters or events or critical incidents. So I think this last point really captures what we as early childhood professionals are actually quite good at doing. This is really deep child development knowledge to be able to, and knowledge of children, you know, individual children, as well as collectively how children engage. This is our professional knowledge that we're really good at. So what's nice about this work is it's really claiming all these things that we do and making them visible, which is why I like the Play World's material, and it's been such an inspiration for me. Gee, where did all that time go? Okay, can I now share some video clips with you from my own work? I'm just going to skip through a little faster. So, as I mentioned before, my curiosity was about how do adults become involved in children's imaginary play, and how does their involvement support concept formation? So I'm going to show you just some examples now, and if any of you are interested, I have a working version of this as a paper, which I'm very happy to send through, to Mark. Yep, and if you let Mark know through the normal processes, I'm just winging it here, yeah, then you can get a copy of this, so you can study it in more detail if you think it's of interest. And this is the slow motion that the children and the teacher created. So we're going to have a look at that first, so you can see the whole, well, not the whole thing, it's too long. The children's narration is musical, and the teacher's helping with this process. Oh, sorry, I'm getting the wrong one. And what you can see here is a blend of abstraction, such as this porridge, or that was the porridge, and this is the recipe, the actual things that they were using, but it's all been brought together. So it's a nice example of what I started the presentation with. And I'm just going to make it go fast forward. You've got the idea. Okay. And that's the bit that you saw previously. And I'll just turn this one off. Okay. So that's the slow motion. And in the context of that, I followed the teachers that were in these centres. And that's just for those of you interested in the research. The amount of data generated is variable because it all depended on what was happening and whether we're able to, how long. And you can see the ages are variable as well, and the numbers of children, numbers of teachers. And which were they? The first three centres all produced slow motions. That was part of their involvement in this project. And the last two didn't. But that's for another story. And what I want to do is just share with you now just a couple of ideas for those of you who are interested in the research process of how I analyse the data, but I'm going to be very quick on this so we can come back to this. The concepts from Elena Kraftsova, Vygotsky's granddaughter, talks about these ways of thinking about the role of the teacher. Yep. And so I was interested to see in video recording the teaching practices with that curiosity in mind. How is the teacher going in and outside of children's imaginary play? What kind of positioning was also occurring in relation to the teacher and the children? And this is just very quickly, it's quite self-explanatory. So the below position is where the child or the adult is in a below or under position, and that just means they're letting others take the lead, so they are following or they're being guided. If you're in the above position, then that person is taking the lead. So that's pretty, and to have if you have somebody leading, you have to have someone following, so it's not, it's always a relation, it's never an individual activity. And the independent position was very much based on, as we might traditionally have said from a maturational point of view, a 2-year-old or a teenager wants to be really independent, does everything they want to do, but they're always checking over their shoulders to see what the adults are saying about this. Is this okay? So that's the independent position. And the primordial we position is really the kind of position you'll see, and I'll give some examples in a minute, of the adult or the child, usually the adult, together. It's sort of like, it's like the umbilical cord is still connected to the infant or the child or the other human being, and one person's taking the full lead and the other is just part of the action, you know, riding along and experiencing whatever's taking place. And we know that when we go on holidays and we have a tour guide, we're often going along not knowing what we're seeing, we're just following the action. And the equal position, of course, is, you know, together, what can we learn about this? Or together, what, you know, how might we solve this problem? So you can, that was kind of the analytical framework. So just, that was really quick. And it's based on Lena's, that's Elena Kraftsova, understanding of the zone of proximal development, which has an elaboration around the potential zone, which I haven't got time to talk to at the moment. This is some images from the Russian context about these ideas of creating collectively imaginary situation of the teacher putting on a hat and creating a storytelling of the wolf, in this case the wolf that's lost its tail and the children are trying to solve the problem. Some of you may have read about that. But here's an example of, from the Russian context, of children taking the above and the below position. Here we are helping an older child because they are multi-age groups, supporting each other. And here is an example of the summer school that I was part of where we have, and I promise you this is not a slideshow of a holiday, this is very much about the student teachers actually learning to be inside imaginary situations. So actually taking on board characters and an audience, and here's the bridge that they're crossing. So they're actually, part of their training is to become part of the imaginary situation and learn the pedagogical practices. So again, so that's just to give you a little bit more insight into this idea, and that was the theoretical framework for looking at the teacher and the children in these different positions within the play. Okay, so what did I learn? These are again images from a summer school, using natural materials to be inside imaginary situation. This is what I learned through this research, following these amazing teachers, and that's not to say each teacher was like this. This is the range of ways in which we position ourselves that related to this idea about being inside children's imaginary play, or collectively creating imaginary play with children. So the first thing that I noticed is there's this idea of teacher proximity in children's play, and I'm going to talk to these very briefly because they're quite self-explanatory. Teacher intent is in parallel with children's play intent. Teacher is following the children's play. Teacher is engaged in sustained collective play with groups of children, and teacher is inside the children's imaginary play. So 5 kind of broad themes, and I'll come back to these, so if you're writing them down you'll get another chance. What's interesting is that when I started to think about these, were they child initiated, teacher initiated, teachers and children being inside the imaginary situation together, what I noticed predominantly was that the teachers were outside of the imaginary situation most of the time. And that's really interesting from a research point of view. So that led to a whole lot of questions around it. But that was what I noticed, and then I unpacked what that meant. And so let's just... How long am I allowed to have? It's okay? Keep going? Yep. All right, stop me. Okay, yep. I'll just do a little head check. Are you falling asleep? Yep. Okay? Yeah, getting some... Oh, somebody up there and snoozing. Okay. So teacher proximity. This one's fairly straightforward, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But the text is only there because I distrust technology and I know that it sometimes doesn't work. So I just want you to look at this visually.
I would have thought we'd explored the light over
what we have,
by now.
what we have in this example is that the teacher is to the side here. So the teacher is in close proximity to the children's play. Very normal practice, as you might expect. And this was kind of predominantly what was occurring. And so that's a plus. So that's one example. It's not to be critical, it's just to illustrate. Then the example of being in parallel. This was conceptually really interesting for me because I had the luxury of video recording the play, but also being able to unpack the play afterwards, which of course you can't do when you're managing lots and lots of children in play. So, but I think it's still very interesting. And what I want to do is just show you a couple of examples. I've written about these, and so if you've read about it, now you get to see the pictures of it. This is an example of a teacher who wanted to develop more science in her program, so looking at concepts. This could be any concept, but this because of my interest, we asked her if she could focus on science. And what she wanted to, in this first example, she illustrates to the children at group time making perfume because she wants to build a program around making perfume. It's something that she's noticed some of the children are interested in. And in the next example, it's about mixtures and potions, so they're all related. And in this very first example, she introduces these. So this is the planned experience, the teacher's intent.
What can we do with it, Mark?
And
What you can do would be you can put some soil in there, then you can put the leaf in there,
Yep.
and you can put the stick on and tie it up, and we can make a very own little tree to take on.
You could. That's a really good
so nothing to do with perfume at all, but some really nice thinking around what you could do with these objects that some of the children hadn't seen before, the mortar and pestle. And then she does a little demonstration. I keep looking at the wrong screen. Let's turn the volume.
I've got some green out of it. You could probably make some more out of that. It does.
Okay, so some explanation, but again, when we now look in the practices in the preschool a little further on, then the experiences are provided. But that was kind of the scene setting for the children, and so there is. So again, the teacher's intent is in parallel with the children, as you'll notice. Oh, looking at the wrong screen again. The child asks. My colleague Avis is there video recording this, and she's narrating over the top of this. But basically the teacher, beautifully in context with the children, in a really positive way, but there is a complete, the child asks about the green stuff. So a really nice link with her saying there's green stuff coming out, but the missed opportunity for developing this further in terms of a science and developing the play further to enrich it, to even take it to where she was wanting to, because she was so committed to, we know that from interviews with her, so committed to following the children's interests only. So if they didn't mention perfume this time, that was okay. And you'll see in this example, this side here, the children just... Oh, sorry. So they come and go, and they have a little. They experience the materials. In the trough are a whole lot of sensory leaves and herbs and things, and so there's some really nice things going on. But if we go back to being inside this situation, conceptually inside the play, then the teacher is not inside. Again, she's on the periphery. So, and there becomes a mixed, that they're working in parallel. Some of you may know this example. This is an example of where she's created really nice, rich experiences throughout the preschool that are focused very much on providing a range of mixtures of substances that the children can actually mix together. And because the children don't know what to do with it, like it hasn't been framed in any way. Like the first one was framed really nicely, to get the situation started. This one was just introduced, and it provided an opportunity for the children to create their own imaginary situation. There's nothing wrong with that, but it just didn't go in the direction that the teacher had planned, again in parallel. And you'll hear throughout this particular example, the children actually taking the potion as medicine, putting it in a spoon, and with their little Humpty Dumpty, they give Humpty Dumpty some medicine, and you hear the child at the very end say, "And he's dead again," because he wants to create. You'll just pick it up just at the end.
He fell off the wall again, and this is the girl. Wait, I'll spray it. I have to spray it. Oh, hi.
So there's Humpty now. You can see Humpty's been well medicated because it's got because they named it as she, has got lots and lots of red dye. And in the other example, this is when, again, providing rich range of materials at the sandpit. In this example, this child is thinking about this mixture as cooking meat. So it's suggested to her cooking meat. And you can see a range of material that have been provided. And the teacher's really trying to draw out a discussion about the oil in the water and the sand and what might be happening. And I'm just summarising it quickly for you because I'm conscious of the time. But so every time she has a discussion, this child is in a very different conceptual space. And so she just listens very politely to the teacher and points and does things. But the moment she has an opportunity, she just goes back to that this is about making meat. So she's putting some more meat in. Lots of sand, she's saying. It goes on for a little while, but you get the idea. And again, lots of moments, of course, as there would in any kind of context, where the interactions were kind of like two different worlds. And so because the teacher wasn't in the child's imaginary situation, and so for me it was really interesting because it opened up some ideas around this idea about what we think we might be providing through the provision of materials and what actually is taking place in the children's mind. So again, not to say any of this is wrong, it's just that it's really interesting to see how children are doing this. So another example now is the teacher is following the children's play. And again, in this example, the teacher is very, very patient and very respectful of what the child is saying. And they've been, in this particular context, this child has decided that she, because it's again with the fairy tales that they're following in this example, want to build a cooling down machine for the porridge so that the bears don't actually have this dilemma, of Goldilocks needing to, for them to go for a walk and then to be robbed by Goldilocks. Very sensible scenario from the child's point of view. And so the teacher's talking about creating an imaginary situation, and she in this clip, which is she talks about using dog hair. I just say that because of you know, the Australian accent is a little harder to follow. And how she conceptualises making of this, so really rich imaginary situation she's created, and the teacher's really respectfully taking this.
How could we make a fridge?
Putting some dog hair on it and putting some dog hair in cement and mixing the cement with dog hair up and putting it straight in the oven and then put it on an ice block and then hammer it and then it'll turn into a thread. Look at
Okay, really rich, but again a really nice example of teacher following the children's play. So she's right there with her in that not inside the play, but following the play. So I think it's another nice example. Then the next example is of a teacher engaged in sustained collective play with groups of children, and I've written about this before too, but it follows very nicely on some of the work that we all know about in terms of shared sustained thinking, of Iram Siraj Blatchford's work in the UK and her colleagues, but looking at it in terms of shared sustained imagination. So, and you saw a little bit of that example in the previous one too, in the sense that the teacher was following, and there was a shared situation, but she wasn't inside that imaginary situation. But there's also this notion of these shared sustained conversations emerging, and that group investigations and an individual imagining in this situation can be really important. And what I'll do is I'll just show you the examples. In this first example, I think everybody knows about Doctor Who, the television program, very popular in Australia. It has been for a long time, of course, UK, and I imagine here. Is that a fair assumption? Yep. So in this first example, these two children are I'll show you the first part of it, are role-playing the TARDIS. They've created their TARDIS and they're, you know, flying the TARDIS. And so this is the children before the teacher engages in the process. So they're having a bit of a conversation first.
I take them off, see? What? The hands of the TARDIS all got the power. Put the power back into the TARDIS. It's just giving now. Do we put our fingers through here?
So they're establishing all of the different parts.
It's no jumping. Skippy. And there's control. Skippy. You can have what Mickey.
Okay, but now we have a beautiful scenario where the teacher actually engages in the experience. She comes along and she doesn't just ask a question and then leave it at that. She actually keeps wanting to find out more. She's a really interested observer of the children's play. So she's become like an audience, which has given the child the possibility to really verbalise the imaginary situation. Again, really important for abstract thinking and conceptual development. So we'll just have a quick look at that.
The dogs can't get first.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Because it comes
So, can we see the force field? Or we can't see it, it's invisible?
We can't see it.
It's invisible.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I see a bit of sand in there. What can you see there?
Okay, so it's given you a little bit of a sense of what she was doing, but she actually did a lot of that, and because of time I won't go into a lot of detail, but that really there was this shared sustained thinking as well as shared sustained imaginary situations occurring. So we start to see, not necessarily in the play, but a very curious observer of the play and really interested to know how the imaginary situation was developing. And she did that even at different times at group time. I won't play it because of time, but the children were just sitting and waiting for group time to start, And the children were talking about lizard dragons, and so she entered into the conversation with the children and became part of discussing this imaginary situation with them. So she was inside, but not for an extended period, and she didn't necessarily develop it, but she was there as part of this shared and sustained conversation of the imaginary situation. So this takes me to the last example, which links back to play worlds where I started, and this is about the teachers being inside the children's imaginary play. And you'll remember that this teacher I introduced you to right at the beginning. Remember I said to you had to hold on to the ideas and it'll all come together at the end? Fingers crossed it will for you. In this example, I want to share with you the teacher being inside the imaginary situation. And I've got two cameras on this teacher. So we're seeing it from the front and from the back. So you're getting the children's expressions as well. So we're going to look at what the teacher does first. It's the same role play of the three bears that you were introduced to earlier on, where the children made that slow motion eventually. And this was over 8 weeks, so it wasn't as though it just happened in 1 week, so keep that in mind as well. And this was a little further into the program. And so what they're doing in this example is that she has, again, the children are there role-playing it, but you will see that she, because of necessity, and even though this isn't free play, so to speak, it's a context in which the role play is occurring at group time, but for necessity she had to become part of the play because they were missing an important prop, which of course was the microwave. Now that they're at the microwave, not the pot stirring, do you recall? So and you'll see what she does.
Let's put it in the microwave. There you go, sit over there. Here, on the microwave, put it in me. Alright, press the button. Oh. Is that the microwave saying it's cooked?
Okay, so here she's clearly in the play, but when she tries to step out of the play, you watch how this child here insists that she goes back into role.
Put that one in the microwave.
Subtly.
Excuse me, we've got to cook each bowl. Oh. Ding, 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 cooked. Next one. Put it in, press the button, Sue. Press the button. Ding, 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 it's cooked.
So this child wasn't just going to let her get away with just doing it once. It had to be for every bowl. So the child is an active participant in this, and she respectfully engages with that process. But I want to show you now from the other camera angle what pleasure it brought that the adult was inside the children's play. I've lost it. There it is.
Press the button.
Which button?
Ding, 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 it's cooked.
So this is kind of nice from the point of view that we can see how much children actually are very happy to have adults in their play, which works against quite a lot of the literature which says that it can only be play if adults are excluded. So I think it's a nice example of being in the imaginary situation. We also tried to create this, and I'm conscious of the time, so I'm just going to show just a quick example where we worked with other teachers to try and get the play worlds to happen. And this is where it became rather challenging because we wanted to have science concepts being explored, and we also wanted teachers to be inside the imaginary situation. So this was part of the professional development that we did with the teachers. It was really hard for people who hadn't had the opportunity like they had in the Russian context to, as part of their teacher education, to practice being inside children's play, to do this. And so we have, and I'll just, how long, 2 minutes? Yeah, 2 minutes. Okay, I'll just tell you about it rather than show you. That the used Enid Blyton, the wishing chair, which some of you may know, to create these imaginary situations. and for the teachers to be inside the play with the children. We even worked with the idea of the transition to go into the imaginary situation, and what we did was we used, the teachers used cloths to create the idea of going inside a microscope. The imaginary play world was all about microbes, and they'd been out exploring things and making photographs using their iPads and so on. And in this particular scenario, then they created the tunnel as entering into the microscope. We also use this device, which is an inflated plastic bag. Don't freak out, it's quite safe. And we can talk about it afterwards, where they went inside this to be part of the imaginary situation. And in the video clip, it shows the teacher setting it up, being inside this space, but not really taking it as far as we thought it could go when we looked at the work that was being done in play worlds by Lindquist and looked at it in terms of the US with Fairholt, or in Finland with Hakkarainen and so on. So we know that it can go a lot further, but it was really hard work to get to this place. And it was hard work because when we examine the Australian context, we are still very much located in this problem space about the role of the teacher. And we're still in this problem space about, you know, how actively you can be involved, because there is this long legacy, like a big shadow over Australia, of developmentally appropriate practice from the past, which is also about a maturational view of development, which has kind of made it hard for teachers to give themselves permission to be inside the imaginary play, particularly when they read things that say play is only play when children control it and adults aren't involved. And so in this I chose deliberately because, again, from this photo, I started with this and ended with this because this is one of the lecturers and this is one of the student teachers actively engaged in learning about how to be in imaginary play situations. And we tried to do this also with the teachers, but it needs more than just a professional development learning experience. So the key ideas, I guess, that have come from this study is it's actually really hard to get inside, in Australia, inside children's imaginary play. But the premise is that if you do, the doors open for all sorts of exciting engagement in developing abstract thinking, developing concepts, because they are moving closer to reality and they are moving away from reality. So they're always in this lovely tension of abstraction, concepts, and real-world situations. And I think my research is, where I'm going with this, is to tease that out a lot further. But it's hard. It's hard for us in Australia. Maybe you've got some good advice about how to get to that space. But it really is, it is a challenge for us. And I guess the key questions that we keep asking ourselves is, you know, what role can we take? How do we feel about being in these situations? And how do we develop the play rather than be outside of it as interested observers? How do we actually develop the play from within the play in the way that we know is possible? And even though the work of Fairholt and others in play worlds has been around developing play, my work is very much focused on how do you then, in that play, also develop specific concepts that, with the kind of worldwide push to make things a little more academic, how can we keep the integrity of what we do really well, but do it on our terms, which is about theorising and naming these really important practices around play, which support learning, and we get better at articulating what our pedagogical role is. So that is it, I think. Yep. Thank you. Over to Helen, the discussant.
Children's teachers and researchers work. You've illustrated that really nicely with all of these examples today. And I think we will all agree with you that in New Zealand it is still very much a problem space about making decisions about when teachers engage with children. Because particularly when they're probably engaged in imaginary play, socio-dramatic play, that's often when teachers think, what is my role here? You know, how do I actually get involved here? So you've given us many ideas in that typology for how teachers might get involved. I think the other controversy that's still there too is this whole notion of developing abstract thinking, developing conceptual thinking, because there's that tendency that as soon as we start to think about that, we worry about the notions of pushed down curriculum, and secondly, where does teacher knowledge fit within that? Because as we know, teachers have to have a reasonable grasp, as you indicated in the missing video, of some aspects of subject knowledge, and it always worries me then too that teachers say that we can co-construct that for children by using really reliable sources such as Wikipedia. So, you've raised a large number of tensions and issues, but yeah, it's been really exciting to have a presentation that brings together within a really quite a focused way of looking at children's play, ways that teachers can engage, and I think bringing up this idea of of following the lead of the play rather than the lead of the children really presents an interesting idea that teachers can follow up on to feel confident about taking that more active positioning. So thank you for that. I have a couple of questions, and one I think maybe we've probably got time for, and amongst see what else comes out, is I think there's a real implication here, as you said, is, we often have the privilege of being researchers, of looking at teachers' work, and sometimes looking at it with them together. But there's an implication here that for teachers to be able to do the kind of work that we are thinking will really help children's concept development, that there needs to be time built in to reflect on their own work. And I'm wondering whether you had the experience of showing some of these videos to the teachers, and what their reflections and experiences were, and what they thought were the implications for what they could take from the project.
Yeah, nice question, Helen. I think for us, what was really important was this was very much a space where we were all learning together. So the examples that those 5 contexts that I shared with you are basically over 15 years of working with people, and at different points we were learning different things. And it's only recently that the slowmation, as a way of making more conscious the concepts that we're trying to capture in children's play, through children's play, and with teachers and researchers working together, became more relevant. And that required a lot of professional development for all of us. And so reflecting, looking at the material, and we've presented the material back to teachers, not the entirety because it's just too much, but this particular typology is only just something very new, so we haven't shown them a typology. But what we have done is talk to them actively about, as part of the research process, the concepts that they are trying to develop, then showing them material, doing the professional development around the slow motion, how do you capture this, and having the deep discussions about how hard it is to create slow motion with a 3-year-old as opposed to a 5-year-old. All of those variations. So there's a whole lot more that I haven't shared here because of time. But certainly it's been a really fabulous journey for all of us to try and do that, to have that collaboration. So yes, it was very much a learning process for all of us, and we didn't research the reflection process. It's something that we could probably look into. I think that would be really important. But we also did the reflection with families, because I didn't talk about that, but we also had families involved, and families had received visual material with all consent of the preschool to see the different play practices and the kind of things that were coming from this. And in some of the families, we had a particular child who had albinism, and we actually worked together with the family who had been part of this process to document that journey as a journey in the preschool and a journey at home. And then we put that together as a research and practice booklet for Early Childhood Australia, which shows these, inclusivity as an everyday practice where you have an alignment between the centre and the home. So there have been kind of different ways that we've also had sort of little mini conferences where teachers have presented their work, and some of the teachers have come to the university and shared with the students as well in the science program. So a range of different ways that we've kind of engaged in that process of better understanding these really important practices that teachers engage in day to day and make more conscious through the research process. Yeah.
I guess that is always, we've talked in New Zealand too, that various teachers and centres become quite fortunate, well, I hope they when they get involved in research, because they do get the access sometimes to the teacher release time that promotes the reflection.
We did that too.
And
yeah.
the introduction of theoretical concepts
Yeah.
to guide their work. And I know both the TLRIs that some of us have been involved in have really tried to look at that. So, and that's another question. I know we don't have time for it, but I'm just going to throw it out there. Is the point where you kind of think about theoretical concepts and teachers, to do that before or the during or the after.
Yeah, we always do it before in this research. I actually take one of the volumes of Vygotsky out, and just as a metaphor really, and talk about what concepts we're using and that we're trying to work with. So not this typology, because that was a synthesis, but individual research projects definitely.
All right, I'm told we've got time to throw some questions to the floor. If you would like to respond to any, Marilyn threw out a lot of provocations in that presentation, so you may have other questions and issues that have come from her work. And
Beautiful.
Hi, I'm Diane McKenzie from Taiatea Kindergarten, and the $64,000 question for me in regard to this is, how do you bring together and resolve the fact that children are moving targets and children play for their own purposes?
Yeah. Nice question. I think that the movement one first, the dynamics of it, absolutely critical. And one of the things we learned in one of our projects when we looked at the play practices across a centre was that there were some beautiful examples of how children actively connect the play of different groups. And the example I'm thinking of is where children had hobby horses and their horses rode into the different play practices. And we followed the riders because then they connected it. Sometimes they put their horses down and engaged in the play, and then they picked up their horses and rode away. Sometimes the horses actually fed into the trough and, if they were doing water play, and changed the play that was going on. So you're absolutely right. The children are a moving feast, but when you actually kind of step back as well and have a look, there often is a kind of a tapestry of play practices, not just at that moment, but over time as well. And we're able to, in some of the work of Sue March, who's my PhD student, she's been able to document how younger children, particularly in mixed age groups, are on the periphery and they watch. And then over time you can actually see them become more and more engaged in the play practices that are going on. So again, it supports this idea that play is a learned activity. And so there is this amazing dynamic going on. What was the second part of your $64,000 question?
Children are moving targets.
Yep, got it, yep.
And children play for their own
Purposes, yeah,
so
yep.
The role of the teacher as a surveillance agent, feeding into political contexts of we want bang for our buck.
Yes,
out
yes.
of what we're funding in early
Yep.
childhood, which leads into push down curriculum, national standards for early childhood, and God forbid everything else that the far right ideology wants to continue to promote. So being articulate about ideas to me seems to be our best defence, but are we actually safeguarding the right for children to play for their own purposes?
Well, can I just say that in response to that, I think that there's probably two things to think about there, is that if the children are playing for their own purposes all the time, what is the kind of opportunity cost that's lost? What opportunities have been lost for developing their play? Because then we know from the research that the dominant play, or the best player, the child who has the most developed sense of play, is the one that then teaches the others how to play. And it might not be quite what you think is acceptable politically, play even. So it's this idea of, so if we just let them free play, then it's never free. It's always politically driven by children, and some children get bullied and all sorts of things can happen. So there's that side of it. But there's also the side of it in what I was trying to present, was that there is also in the play world's literature, children aren't in play worlds all the time. So the play worlds become, and I'm thinking of this when I think of a very poorly resourced centre in terms of materials. If what they're engaging in is an imaginary situation, changing the meaning of objects, found objects or whatever it might be, it can be the poorest environment, it can be under a tree, it can be anywhere, it can be in a remote community. And yet the teacher can be taking these children on an amazing imaginary situation that actually creates and develops their play and gives the children meaning, and that they're not, and I have seen this when I've been out visiting, this is not my research now, but when I've been out visiting students, sometimes I go to some centres and it's like a zoo, in the sense that children are climbing furniture and doing all sorts of things that are not productive. If they're climbing furniture because there was a reason for it, but they're climbing furniture because there's nobody guiding them conceptually or thinking about an imaginary situation. They're just bored, you know, so what do? You climb the furniture. You know, you build better physical skills because there's nothing else to do. But if you create an imaginary situation, how exciting is that? And where can that take you, and how can families be involved? Can the imaginary situation go on, and, you know, it can be the imaginary box that doesn't exist? I think it depends on what you're thinking in relation to the purposes then. And I think the push-down curriculum, as I mentioned right at the very end, why don't we continue to claim what we can do really well and discuss this idea of what does play really mean? It's not just the work of children, it's not just they do whatever they like, it's sophisticated knowledge of our pedagogy, that we know that children in these imaginary situations engage with abstraction and concepts. But we have to stand up and actually take the lead in developing that further, because otherwise it doesn't go further. So we have a really important role, and we should claim it, name it, and do it.